Hey, it's Maria here, and you might have heard a lot of photographers talking about histograms and be wondering what the heck a histogram is. So today I am going to teach you just that. In this lesson, you're going to learn what a histogram is, how to use a histogram, and how you want your histogram to look on your camera or on your editing software. So first things first, what is a histogram? A histogram is actually a graph that shows how much dark information you have in your photo and how much light. So how many blacks and how many whites and all the grays and other tones in between. It's kind of like a map of where all the different tones in your photo are. So you have a histogram on your camera. If it's a digital camera, if it's film, sorry, you're not going to have a histogram. But all digital cameras should have a histogram, and you can use the histogram when you are viewing your photos and when you are taking the photos. So if I turn my camera on, then you should be able to see my histogram just there. So it is showing the blacks on the left and all the whites on the right. So if I cover up my lens like this, it's going to move all the way over to the left because it's all black. And if I was overexposing my image and it was all white, or if I was pointing at the sun, it would all move over to the right. But you can see on my camera that it is a pretty well exposed image because the graph isn't touching the right or the left hand side of the graph. So that means you've got a fairly good exposure, and you can see there's a lot of kind of midtones in the middle. If the graph is touching the sides, then we call that clipping. And you don't really want to have clipping on your histogram unless you are doing it for a specific reason. The reason being is because if your whites are clipping, say they're going right off the edge of the graph, then that means you're losing detail in those whites. And the same with the blacks. If the black part of the black side of the graph is touching the side there and going off the edge, then that means you are going to have no detail in some of your blacks in your photo. So you'll notice you also have a histogram when you are editing in you can pull it up anywhere actually, like in Lightroom and in Adobe Photoshop, and what's the other one? In Camera Raw. That's the one I was looking for. And you can edit your images to bring in your whites and your blacks. Of course, this is better if you are using raw images. You can get a lot of that detail back if you have gone outside the histogram and you're clipping on the edges. If you're using raw, you can actually bring some of that detail back, but if you're using JPEG, you can't, or you can't bring it back so easily. Anyway, let's just say you can't bring it back at all. Okay, just shoot in raw if you think you might need to fix it in your editing software. Okay, so now we'll go and look at it in Adobe Lightroom. So I'll just show you here. And it should bring up some of my photos here. Here are some old photos that I took in the Coromandel that I haven't edited. And we'll go over here. Move my photo. So you can see here that there are a lot of darks or blacks in this photo, and they're actually going off the edge and not so many whites or bright areas in the photo. It's not actually really a lot in the midtones either because we're not seeing much in the graph. So what we can do is with the exposure is if you can see if we move it, then we can brighten it up a little, but now we're starting to get clipping in the highlights and the shadows. So you'll notice I move between saying highlights and shadows and whites and blacks, but they're pretty much the same thing. So to correct, what do you do if you're in a situation like this where you've got clipping in the highlights and in the shadows? Well, one thing you could do is you could just bring the highlights back down and it's still clipping a little bit and fix the shadows. So we'll go into the shadows and you can see you can brighten up your shadows or darken them. So we can brighten up our shadows a little bit. You just want to be a little bit careful. If you've used a high ISO and you're brightening up the shadows, then it's going to start looking quite grainy. So if you don't want to do that, you can double click to reset that. You could bring your exposure up here. So you're getting a brighter image, and then go to your highlights here and you could bring those highlights down. If I'm looking at the photo itself, I'm not really liking how those highlights are looking still because they're a little bright. So I'm going to bring them down a little, and then I could put make the shadows a little bit brighter as well. So that's starting to get a little better. Maybe I'd play with my blacks and whites a little bit. This is clearly not a well-edited shot yet. We're going to have to spend a bit more time on it if we want this particular shot to look good. But you can kind of see that we're getting this histogram more where we want it to be, kind of not clipping so much in the shadows or the highlights. So that's an example of how you can use your histogram. And why would you want to use a histogram in Lightroom or Camera Raw if you can already see what the photo looks like? And the answer to that is because screens all look different, and sometimes they're calibrated differently, and sometimes you're not seeing the true what the highlights and shadows are truly doing. So the histogram is the most accurate representation of what the photo truly is going to look like to someone else, or if you print it or whatnot. So that is pretty much a summary of what a histogram is. It is a graph that shows you where your highlights and your shadows and your midtones are in your photo. You can see it on your camera, you can see it on your editing software, and it really helps to show where your highlights and shadows truly are and if you are losing detail in them or not. So I hope that really helped. And if you want to learn more, click on my link below to grab some awesome free resources